Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the latest webinar from the IMI. For those of you that don't know who I am, my name is James Skoltock, and I'm the editor of the IMI's Motor Pro magazine, and I'll be hosting today's event. This is the latest webinar from the Institute, which has been running a variety of similar events covering an array of topics. So please check out the COVID section of the IMI's website, and you can catch up what's been before. But today, and I hope you're all ready for a really interesting session, the automotive industry has shown great resilience, and now over 95% of businesses have reopened, and more are following as we slowly navigate our way out of the pandemic. But there are still challenges that remain, which is why we're putting on this Q&A. So this is your opportunity to put your questions to the IMI CEO, Steve Nash, along with our two guest panelists today. Joining Steve is Hayley Pells, Director at Independent Business via Speed Shop, and Tom Denton, Industry Consultant at Automotive Technology. So use the Q&A functionality in the Zoom call and get your questions primed, and we'll try our best to answer as many of them as we can. Should we run out of time, because there are always the limits, we'll try and get back with answers to all those questions that we unfortunately can't get to, but we will try and answer as many as we possibly can. But before we begin, I'll hand over to Steve Nash now so he can give a short update on what's been happening. Steve, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, James. Listen, it's great to have you all join us today. We've been running, obviously, a series of webinars right the way through since the beginning of lockdown. One of the first ones we did was on a similar format to this, but obviously looking at the issues that were pertinent at the time. And not surprisingly, back then, the questions surrounded things like the coronavirus job retention scheme, the various government loan schemes and other support mechanisms that were out there, and helping to kind of cut through the fog of that a little bit. Clearly, as you've heard, I mean, as James said, the vast majority of businesses are now back and operating at as great a capacity as the circumstances allow, really. And that brings about some different challenges, that kind of restart and getting the businesses back going again after having been completely shut down in many cases. So that's the sort of nature of the type of questions that we'll be looking at today and the kind of issues that are surrounding that. So without further ado, I'm going to hand back to James to facilitate that discussion.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Steve. We're going to do it slightly differently today and lose the presentation, so you're not staring at the same image and same wording all the time. But the first opening question we have, these have been very challenging times, to put an understatement on it slightly. But the first question we had is, if you found yourself in this position again, how would you deal with it? Would you deal with it differently? And what would you do differently? I'll leave that open to whoever wants to answer first.
Okay, well, being the gentleman that I am, I'm gonna let Hayley speak first, and then I'm more than happy to offer my thoughts on that. But Hayley, over to you.
Thank you very much, Steve. We're very much at the coalface here in our part of the aftermarket. And I feel sometimes that we can be a bit of a canary in the coal mine as to what's happening with the rest of the industry. When the pandemic first reached our shores and we started with our contingency planning, it was my expectation that we would remain open throughout. We have a lot of motorists who are key workers themselves, as we are. And I felt it was important that we would contribute and do our bit, that sort of resilient Dunkirk spirit. As the situation developed, we found that this wasn't going to be the option for us, and we did end up having a lockdown for 3 weeks over the Easter period, and we had to continuously reevaluate the situation. So although we had planned to remain open, following that re-evaluation, we had to shut. We needed to rest our troops. We needed to consolidate our supplies. We needed to get new supplies in, and we needed to develop new safe working practices. And the only safe way to do that was to shut. So to return back to the question, I suppose Yes, I would do exactly the same thing again. It was the right thing for us to shut for that brief period, just to really screw down our procedures. But I suppose with such a live question that you have to continuously ask yourself, should I be open? And you've got to put your motorists and your team first.
Yeah, that's that's a great answer, actually, Tom. I know you've been working with a whole load of you've been working with a whole group of businesses, haven't you? You know, you might like to give a kind of view on that, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, Haley summarised the situation really well, of course, Steve. But we've ended up with a group of, you know, several thousand people from across the country. There are a range of small businesses, larger businesses, individual technicians, and so on. And what became really clear very soon is that one size certainly didn't fit all. Some people chose to work through all the time, you know, and put certain precautions in place. And of course, the advice that's been coming down to us has been somewhat variable as it happens. So people have changed, you know, changed tack here and there. But generally, people have found a way through. And also, some people who decided to close down and furlough or whatever was necessary to do that are now open again, but actually put their time to good use. I mean, one of the things I've enjoyed most of all, I think, in our group, and Haley may agree, is pictures of shiny workshops. People have, you know, taken the opportunity to kind of put things in place, reevaluate the business. And that's been quite interesting, particularly the business reevaluation, because this is, you know, some of the other questions that we had in advance sort of related to this, didn't they? So we'll perhaps come back to that in a little while under James's guidance. But people have made use of the time to stop and think, and it's been quite interesting to see that.
I think it's also important to consider that there is also a financial advantage to shutting and resting your team, because that does give you that focused period of time to get things in place to then make sure that you're most efficient when you return to work.
Yeah, I guess, Haley, it sort of depends how long that shutdown is, doesn't it? Really, it's you know, I guess the longer it goes on, the advantages diminish somewhat. But I think from our point of view, from an IMI point of view, it's an interesting thing because, you know, it's a business requirement that you have variously called a business recovery plan or a disaster recovery plan or whatever. And we always have had that in place, and we always have exercised it on the assumption that, you know, theoretically your building might burn down, or, you know, there might be something that prevents you from accessing your facilities or whatever. And actually, it's amazing how well it worked when we actually had to use it for real, because the notice about the lockdown was pretty short, really. You know, it was really a day or two before we literally shut the facility down. And we've only really just opened it up to a small degree now. So we've been shut since sort of late March, right the way through to this week. As I say, we've only got a limited number of people going in now, but the speed with which we adapted to working remotely was incredible, really. We haven't furloughed anybody. Well, that's not quite true. There are a couple of people we furloughed who asked to be furloughed for childcare reasons, but that's not quite the same thing, and we were happy to accommodate that. But actually, we've kept the whole team working. I think that's sort of necessary for an organisation like ours, really. It's no good for us not to be there when people need us, you know, otherwise what's the point of being a member, you know? So I think that we've you know, I'm actually very pleased with the way we've adapted to the situation, and I think it'll inform how we work going forward. You know, it's opened our eyes to different possibilities.
I guess one of the major things that people, businesses and individuals will have learnt about is health and safety, basically, because this whole pandemic has literally been about health and safety. But what lessons moving forward will companies have to learn? And, you know, in terms of investment in health and safety materials and knowledge as well, what will businesses have to look at?
Prior preparation and planning, James. It prevents poor performance. And I think what we're all going to take away from this is a need for contingency. And although, as Steve very accurately describes, the needs of a larger organization do set a requirement for this kind of planning from the offset. But I think the smaller business could take advantage of this forced period of absence from the workplace or absence from normal procedure in order to develop some kind of planning for any future disasters. Because as Steve says, it's the disaster plan is the same, and you insert disaster here, and then you follow that procedure.
Is it just knowledge then, or does it require further investment as well compared to what we knew before this all started?
I think this was definitely something that almost nobody planned for. I think probably if you look around the world, the only people who were relatively well prepared for it were the likes of Singapore, South Korea, who had the SARS epidemic. So they had a dress rehearsal. But I think what we now realise, of course, is by virtue of this, is how vulnerable we all are, how vulnerable the entire economy is. So I think that I think some of the measures that people are being asked to take in the workplace now are. I wouldn't like to say whether or not those will be required in the long term, because assuming we find a way through this epidemic with inoculations and what have you. But I think it does make you realise how important it is, though, to have, like Hayley says, it's whether you're sorting out a situation as big as this or something much smaller. It is all in the planning and preparation. If you've got the right kind of general procedures in place, you can scale them up or scale them down. I would imagine. I don't know what you guys think, but
I agree, Steve. I mean, if I can come back in and maybe just link it tentatively with one of the questions that's just popped up from Tony on the screen. One of his valeters has been asking about how safe it is when working on a customer's car. I don't think any of us here would say that we're particularly qualified to answer that question itself in great detail, but I'd link that back with how Hayley was saying, I think, that sometimes a little bit of extra investment is necessary. And I know some companies now have started to invest in sort of defumigation, cleaning type machines and things like that. And using this for safety reasons, but also using it as an opportunity. I mean, I know some companies that we've had contact with who've invested in sort of high-level cleaning and disinfecting equipment of some description, and are charging for it as a service. So they've turned it into a business opportunity. It's, there's no reason that we should work for free to help people through this particular crisis. So, there are different ways of thinking about it. So it can be seen as an opportunity in a few cases, perhaps.
We now have a basic level sanitation procedure, which is at zero cost to the motorist, and we factored into our normal day-to-day expenses. But we then build on that. So everybody gets the basic sanitation procedure, and that's there to protect our team as well as our motorist. But when you're spraying a sanitation product over the car, it does leave track marks. It doesn't look like it's been cleaned. It looks like somebody's just gone and dumped sanitizer all over it. And very quickly, this, as Tom said, developed into an opportunity. And we now, for the first time, have a wash and vac service, which we've never offered before. And to touch on the questions that have come in, we have invested in PPE, and we do charge appropriately for that type of vacuuming. We don't do it as the cheapest vacuuming that you could get before the crisis, because we have experienced increased costs. But on top of that, I'm also seeing an increase in servicing. And previously, I used to have to explain to the motorist how important a pollen filter was. Now motorists are coming in and wanting the pollen filter changed. So there is a definite change in how the motorist interacts with our service and what they're asking for. And as Tom said, it's being reactive to that kind of demand.
Yeah, and I guess as well, Hayley, I mean, the suppliers have been pretty quick to react with products that that will do the job. So there's no shortage of those, I don't suppose.
And I guess when you were talking, Hayley, you mentioned that you're offering new services, but you have to try and absorb the costs almost of what you're offering. So does that mean that moving forward, that companies are going to have to start looking at their pricing structures?
Initially, we absorbed the cost using the grant that was made available to us from the government. We used that grant straight away in order to procure PPE and the new suite of chemicals that we needed to buy and the training that we needed in order to use them safely. There's a lot of cleaning chemicals that you mustn't mix together unless you want to and then cause some kind of explosion. But that's not the best way to deal with everybody's car. And we then need to communicate that throughout the whole team, and that time costs money, and you have to develop that procedure and put it in place and make sure people, sometimes with the greatest will in the world, they're trying to just use every product in order to be as safe as they can, is inappropriate, and those chemicals react together badly, and then you create a worse situation rather than trying to get rid of the situation that you find yourself in. Yeah, there was an initial cost, but that was our grant did cover that. And then in order to replenish the chemicals and the PPE that we're using, we haven't found that has impacted that greatly on our bottom line. So our government grant really did help us get us out of that situation and prepare adequately.
Okay, but obviously now we're out, well, coming out, sorry, I shouldn't say we're out quite yet because it's still ongoing. But in terms of how businesses are going to adjust to where we are now and moving forward, in terms of, and we've spoken about learning lessons and what we need to know, in terms of safety and hiring practices, how is that going to change from now going forward over the course of the months?
Hiring practices as in taking on staff, you mean?
Yes. Yeah.
Well, it's actually, we've just done a recruitment exercise for 2 new board members for the IMI, for which we had an awful lot of applications, and we have a nominations committee that do that work, part of subcommittee of the board. This is no different to employing, whether it's a non-executive director you're looking at, or whether you're talking about an employee in your business. That was all conducted remotely. It's all conducted over this kind of technology, and it's perfectly possible. It's I'm not going to use that hackneyed phrase, a new reality. I would say it's just the current reality. I mean, James, I mean, you did almost say there, now we're coming out of it, and we're not, don't you? I mean, look at Manchester. I'm not sure we're coming out of it at all. I mean, I don't want to be a kind of Jonah on this, but I mean, we've got potentially the worst period of the year coming, which is the sort of the normal flu season and everything else. And I think that I think it would be naive of us to think that we're just on an ever upward slope from here. I think the question that a lot of people would ask themselves perhaps is, and it goes back to that question we covered at the beginning, what would you do differently? I think for many businesses, I mean, bear in mind that I think we might see the government do things slightly differently, and I think they might be a bit more selective in who they asked to shut down and who they didn't. So particularly the service and repair side of the industry was always technically allowed to be open, but I think 87% of it wasn't during the remembering the stats we had sort of early in the lockdown, about 87% the service and repair industry. So 13% kind of stayed open to look after vital workers, and I think probably people would be tempted to stay open to a greater extent going forward. Now that we know what safe procedures look like, I think at the time everyone was worried to death about their staff, rightly so. I think now that we have very well understood procedures in place, I think people would endeavour to keep the businesses running. It would all depend on what the government would allow, and I think, so I think that on the basis that we could be dealing with this for quite a while. I mean, we've certainly planned how we're going to work at least up until the end of the year with our staff, and giving them forward notice of that, so that and I think that's the key thing, isn't it? I think if you plan for the worst, you know that might not be what happens, but so yeah, I think you just have to carry on and use what you can, and that's technology like this. Sorry, long answer. I'll shut up now. I'll let the others talk.
Agree with what Steve is saying there, and I think that in part answers James Dillon's question about contingencies existing within the group for the potential second lockdown. I agree with Steve completely that we will perhaps get more refined guidance from the government in order to act upon, and the social media shaming that existed at the start of the lockdown of businesses that remained open were subjected to quite extreme social media reaction, even from people who wouldn't normally engage with that business seem to curate an opinion as to whether or not that business should be open. And that can be hugely impactful on how, in particular, a small business operates. We're a much smaller team here at Avia, so we've put our plan in through to the end of April next year, but that's been in line as an MOT test station, in line with the MOT testing structure that is going to be happening. I've booked my holiday in April because I'm anticipating it to be extremely quiet, so that does in part make up some of that contingency. We had another question from Mr. Woolley, I saw, about why we didn't sanitize cars before, and I'd really like to address that, because this is something that I feel in my business is going to be changed forever. When motorists are driving, they hold onto the steering wheel, they're concerned about being safe on the road, and when they sneeze all over the steering boss. So I'm sticking with sanitation forever, and I don't know how I operated for the last 15 years now without wiping cars down. And so that is part of our contingency plan to try and operate safely if there is a second lockdown, as a key worker, as a business that will be expected to stay open. So that is part of our contingency, and I totally agree. Why did we work on dirty, filthy cars beforehand? So, Mr. Woolley, I completely agree.
Good answer, Hayley. I mean, I'd come back in. I mean, I'm lucky. The majority of the work I do involves sitting most of the time where I am at the moment, but you know how things will change and move. I can perhaps just pick on Andy's question, who's a trainer, from the questions that have been coming in, and how things have been impacted by lockdown as far as training is concerned. And I think Andy's suggestion is that, you know, some places have reacted and allowed online training, and others haven't. But the Zoom meeting is going to continue, I think. And more training will be done in this way, and you know, more visits. We could envisage, you know, that instead of the company rep visiting Hayley's workshop, there'll be some kind of Zoom meeting to deal with this. I think these are the sort of things that are going to happen in the future, and it's not going to change quickly. So, Andy, that probably doesn't cover anywhere near all of the depth of your question, but you know, I do know that lots of educational establishments are seriously looking at switching at least a large amount of what they do. And I know as the IMI, we've been looking very carefully at better ways of carrying out endpoint assessments with social distancing and all of these sort of things going on. So this is, I've got to say, this is the new thing.
No, don't say it. Don't say it.
I didn't. I changed it a little bit at the end, if you know.
I do think
the new thing, and actually in some cases I quite like it.
Well, Tom, I think that, sorry Hayley, go on, carry on.
I do feel, though, with particularly young people who are engaging in their training, we've had to keep up with them, because they're all already engaged with this technology and this method of communication. So we've been educating ourselves with a technology that they were already native, and we've had, I think we've caught up particularly well with some settings, and I'd like to see more of this kind of interaction. And to answer Peter Cox's question, which has come in, the winners and the losers of the pandemic, who the panel will see as winners and losers. Well, I think that's a really interesting question, and I think training will be one of the winners. The blended learning approach, I think this hasn't been a catalyst for change. This has been a turbocharge, and training is going to be one of the winners for this. People are going to be able to learn at their own pace, and if there's something that that they need to spend some more time on, the blended learning approach using any kind of digital technology lends itself so well to that. So I think they are going to be the big winners for this. The losers, I think, could potentially be traditional sales techniques that don't embrace change. I think there is a huge opportunity for sales at the moment, but if you are particularly stuck in one way of selling something, then that might be an area which could lose.
Yeah, it's interesting actually, because there's a question from Mike Murphy. That's a name from my past. It's nice to hear from you, Mike. But Mike was asking about when we might see, when manufacturers might approve the return of their regional and district managers to do their face-to-face job. And actually, I mean, we have a very large field-based team ourselves, and we've just had to adapt. You know, I think it's not a question of not working. They've done a tremendous amount remotely using. I mean, it's funny because I was aware of Zoom before the lockdown because some of our teams had started using it, but I'd never personally used it. I'm never off the damn thing now. But I think that regardless of what platform you're using, I mean, there are even this webinar platform. We've used this for a number of our meetings. It's a great way of facilitating a meeting. I just think that people would do things differently because it's more than just dealing with the pandemic issue. I think you realize the efficiency. You know, I know myself. I mean, I lost count of the number of times I've driven an hour to go to an hour's meeting and then driven an hour back again. I really don't think I'd do that going forward. I would prefer to do it this way. You tend to be more succinct in these kind of meetings as well. I think sort of 90 minutes in front of Zoom is probably about as much as you really want to do. Whereas those kind of meetings rumble on a bit when you're having them face to face. So I think we all understand we're human beings, you know, an interaction, human interaction is really important. You know, I won't say that we don't miss that. I think we've had a couple of board meetings now via Zoom, really, really good, efficient board meetings, but you do miss those chats by the coffee machine and the stuff you pick up. So we need to find a way of doing that, but we might have to, depending how long this all goes on, we might have to, introduce actual meetings where you don't talk about business, but you talk about what might be seen as trivia, but is actually important and for those kind of personal engagement. So I imagine the manufacturers will be thinking in a similar way to that, you know, and whoever has got field staff will be thinking, well, you know, we've got to keep the contact going, but we'll have to use whatever means we can while the restrictions exist.
I think that starts to wrap up or answer the question from James Dillon of the element of online training. Do the panel feel is better? I think this is an excellent question from James, and which do not carry particularly well over to the online world. And I think Steve really does illustrate how important it is, especially when you're teaching something, that human interaction is so important to check that understanding, it's hit home. And as it's as important at board level as it is at training level. Has the message been clearly understood? Yeah. And I think Steve really does illustrate how we are losing something there and we need to address it. And that sort of leads into Sterling Wood's question about the emotional and psychological impact of lockdown on staff and also our trainees. Furloughing, working from home, the advantages Steve described of not having to do that commute is sometimes outweighed by the temptation to not stop working. So whereas normally you would leave the office and you would go home, sometimes that commute serves as the sever that the workday is over and that you can now relax with your family. Whereas if you're at the dining room table and you're at home, perhaps with your children, or you've had parcels arriving all day or something like that, and you think, oh, I've not contributed enough to my working day today, I'll just do that extra half hour, that extra hour, and then all of a sudden you're working through your meal time or something like that. So all I've done is sort of raise the question. And I would like to ask Tom, just out of my own curiosity, as somebody who is a seasoned home worker, he is a veteran of this type of working. We could look to experienced people like Tom as to how to educate ourselves for the potential mental problems that could come about with this style of working. How do we prevent? Teach us, Obi-Wan.
Thank you, Hayley. May the force be with you. And just before I give my view on that, I just want to pop back to James's question, really, which is a very good question. And under normal circumstances, I'd go and ask James that question and get the answer in that way around. But you know, clearly there are some things that work online, and clearly there are some things that don't. And I see as we move forward that there are going to be different ways of achieving different things. There are certain meetings that just lend themselves to a Zoom meeting. But as Steve said earlier on, you know, you don't get the water cooler moments or that we all meet up and stay overnight and we go and have dinner and a few beers in the pub and all the important kind of bonding that goes along with that. But as far as training is concerned in particular, I think we are going to move much more towards the, what would be the right word, the kind of prerequisites, the things that need to be done. So do this, you know, read this first or do this online first, and we have some way of assessing all of that process. And then, you know, maybe half the sized group will attend for face-to-face training and then the other half comes the day after or something like that. But I do still think it's got to be a balance between, you know, social things as well as getting together for work. So that was that one. But as far as actual home working goes, I mean, this doesn't really apply to a lot of people who'll be listening because, like yourself, Hayley, you know, you've got to go into the workshop and pick up the bag of spanners and the voltmeter, you know.
I still haven't figured out to fix stuff over Zoom.
No, well, we're working on it. But the key thing for me about home working, though, is I never have thought of it as being 9 to 5 or 9 to 6. I've always thought of there's some work that needs to be done this week or this day or over this period of time, and we get that sort of work done rather than thinking, oh, it's 5 o'clock, it's time to knock off, or it's 9 o'clock, it's time to start. I mean, you know, perhaps I shouldn't admit this on an open like Zoom meeting, but I often start work early in the morning in my pajamas and dressing gown, you know, because that's not on the Zoom meetings, I hasten to add, you know, but that's the way to start the day, and then you get certain things done, you go and have a shower, you know, and stuff like that. So you're actually taking advantage of the situation.
I think culturally, Tom, and when we've talked about this a lot, it depends the sort of organisation you are.
Yeah,
whether you're an organisation that measures outputs or inputs, you know, and look, it's very, very different. When you've got a physical job to do, that's a completely different situation. And when you've got cars to repair, there's no way of doing that from in a flexible way, is there really? But in general terms, I think a lot of companies still struggle with the idea that if I can't see you working, you may not be working. You're probably watching Homes Under the Hammer or something, heaven forbid. But the reality is, I don't honestly care if people watch Homes Under the Hammer, as long as they get the job done. As long as the outputs are what I expect, because they might work all sorts of odd hours if they're working at home, particularly if they've got kids or whatever. So they might not work a structured 9 to 5 day, but as long as the things that are expected come out the other end, that's what you should be worried about. And I think that does take that's probably an easier mental jump for some than others. You know, it's definitely, look, I mean, there are an enormous number of businesses that I know of that have decided to abandon their head offices. You know, they've just said, oh, we're not going to go back into our head, or our lease came up, we're not going to renew it. We're going to leave people working at home, or we've halved the size of our building, I'm not even sure we'll use our building the same way in the future, but we're not, we're not out there in the retail world. That's a different thing. But I definitely think look, I mean, one of the things that's patently obvious is that going into the lockdown, if you were pretty well set up to sell cars online, you were much better off than people who weren't. So whatever services you could offer remotely, if you were into that idiom already, that was a big advantage. And I think most people will look very carefully at how their business is structured in the future and consider whether or not, and that comes back to that winners and losers thing. I think there's no doubt that a lot of companies have been hit very, very hard by this situation. There is some recovery going on at the moment. I think July was actually quite a good month for the industry, but yeah, I think it's going to be the ones that adapt the quickest. It always is that come out the other side best.
The agile will survive.
Yeah, it's always the case, isn't it? I face it's a bit of a truism, really.
And does that mean, you talk about companies surviving, but does that mean that they've then got to invest more in their marketing so they can draw business in? They've got to invest more in their training so they can offer more skills and possibly more wages, things like that, in order to succeed coming out the other side?
I don't think it's that would be a whole bunch of negatives, and I don't think it has to be like that. I mean, I think we all look to work smarter, not harder, don't we, if we can? And I don't think that what we've seen is trends that were already happening, just accelerating. Depending on what business sector you look at, digitization, which was rapidly moving forward, in some cases has moved forward 2, 3, even up to 5 years in a matter of months, because people have had to kind of adopt different ways of doing things. I think our own industry was heading down a more digital route, but again, this has all been accelerated by the lockdown. So I think, look, I mean, that's very big picture stuff. I mean, I think we were looking at changes to the way we sell and distribute and deliver cars anyway, but I think this is probably, we've seen the same with the move towards electrification. You've only got to look at the SMMT's latest figures. There's no great technical reason why diesel should be dead, but it bloody is. I mean, the numbers are going south at a rate of knots, and we're suddenly seeing quite a big uplift in hybrids and plug-in cars. So it's a profound change really that we're going through.
I agree.
But it isn't all negative.
Yeah, can I just quickly pick up on a couple of the questions? Hayley looked at them briefly before as well, from Sterling and Daniel, excuse me, both asking about, a rift between staff that were furloughed and not.
I was particularly interested in that question from Daniel.
Yeah,
I mean, the answer from all of the people I know, Daniel and Sterling asked a similar question as well, is yes. In some places there has been a few issues, but in other places they have managed it by alternating the furloughing in some way. But I can't profess to know the answer to the problem, but I can only say that if that's something that you're struggling with a little out there, then you're not alone.
I think also to follow on with Daniel and on from Tom, it's something that, as Steve said, you need to have contingency planning for, and it's almost like you've got to follow the flow chart of what may happen with each potential outcome. And treating people fairly is not always treating people the same, and having a transparent procedure that everybody in the team has got a contribution to, I think, is how you can reduce that kind of rift from happening within your team. But that communication then needs to be continued. So if you've got members of your team that are furloughed or are shielding, or even just on holiday during these times, because using holiday allowance, we're all accruing this holiday, but we're not actually taking it, and it is quite an accepted practice to ask, will you go on holiday this week? Because we do need to start getting people off, and you've got nowhere to go. It's a bit of a rubbish holiday, really. So I think that can lead to a feeling of a pushing out of different members of your team. And it all just comes back to, you do need to communicate, perhaps even over communicate, and reach out and make sure everybody has contribution.
It's a worrying time. It's a worrying time, isn't it? Because daily we're confronted with news of business closures and redundancies. And one of the big dealer group chief executives likened it to picking a football team. And it's hard for people who are left on the bench to see it as a positive. And it might not signal anything. It might just mean that the people who've been brought back first are the ones that just happen to be needed at that point in time. It doesn't mean to say that you're automatically not needed, but clearly you're going to feel more worried if you're still on furlough than if you're not. And so communication is incredibly important, I think, to give people, you can't make promises you can't keep, but at the same time you've got to keep people engaged, haven't you? I mean, the idea that people would be sort of out of sight, out of mind would be a horrible thought.
I think also the recent change to the furlough guidance, in that when employees are in a furlough situation, that they can now engage in training, which for us was a significant change. So if people are entering furlough, they can enter furlough with a plan, with an outcome and something that is achieved. Curating your own training in this way, through in your own time, perhaps even in your pajamas like Tom.
Not now, though. Not now.
We're not entirely sure of that, Tom, but we'll believe you.
Okay.
There's a couple of questions from Chris Newton, and one of them it's quite pertinent because I've just literally, put out a press release on this. But do the panel think that the recent additional grants for apprenticeships will make a difference to employers taking on new starts this year? And this refers to the extra money that the government have made available to support apprenticeships. So I think it's £2,000 for the younger apprentices and £1,500 for the slightly older apprentices. I've been involved with a large number of employers and have made representations on their behalf to government about the levy. They're basically asking for the levy, not just for our sector, for all sectors, but to be the clawback of the levy, which gets, the money gets taken back on a monthly basis, to be ceased for 2 years, to give the businesses time to recover so they can accumulate that money and then reinvest it in apprenticeships going forward. So apprenticeships in our sector are down 87% at the moment. That's the highest of any sector. They're down about 60% in all sectors, but they're down 87% in our sector, which for a sector that actually gets a lot of its young talent through apprenticeships is very, very worrying. But what I have been saying to those employers in the meantime is, whilst you're waiting for a decision from government, which isn't going to come before the autumn at the earliest, the autumn statement maybe, you can be spending that levy, not just on training technicians, but on training. There's loads and loads of different apprenticeships you can use, and you can use that extra money from government. So don't just sit there and watch that money being clawed back. Find other ways to use it.
Steve, I think that's a great answer. And one of the challenges for me on Chris's question here is that I think, yes, it will make a difference, but we need to make sure people know about it, and act on it is always a key problem, isn't it?
Yeah, and that's something we're doing an awful lot of work around with employer forums and so on. So that, because it's just like the coronavirus job retention scheme and everything else, it needs explaining to people. It needs, people sort of understand it broadly, but they need, this is what it could mean for you. And so, yeah, we're working on that, but it's a good question.
Chris's final question of shift patterns and things like that, it does seem to be a common sense thing, but we found that cars are more than 2 meters long. So we have been able to effectively social distance. How tight are you working in that workshop, Chris?
No, Chris is from a training company.
Oh, right. Okay, sorry.
Yeah. Okay, people. Unfortunately, we've run out of time. It's been a really interesting session, I think, and I hope everybody that's been joining us has got a lot out of it. For any of the questions that we have missed, and I don't think there was that many, I think everyone's been really good at getting the answers in, but we will attempt to get a good answer back to you if we have missed it. But other than that, I'd just like to thank Steve, Hayley and Tom for their time and answering the questions, and everybody else for taking part in the webinar. I just want to direct you, if you want to catch up with anything that was said or catch up with any of the previous webinars, head over to the IMI's website and look at their COVID page, because they're all listed there and free to access. And apart from that, thank you again to the panelists and to everybody who viewed.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
Hayley and Tom.